Hello everyone and welcome to our last module for Politics 1500. It's been a great semester so far. I've really enjoyed working with you and I'm delighted that we have managed to stay on time and make such wonderful progress towards this final class. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves and I hope you feel that you've learned some things about how we can think about problems that we see in the world and how those problems get framed. After all, this was a class where we started, if you remember, thinking back to the very beginning, we were talking about, unconscious ideologies or subconscious ideologies and the role that those subconscious ideologies played in framing the problems that we see in the world, what we chose to see, what we didn't choose to see, and how sometimes those choices were being made by us in ways that were unconscious to us. But we tried to introduce ourselves to some concepts and some tricks and games, scenario thinking that would show us, in fact, that oftentimes the thinking that we take for granted in our brains is actually thinking that is directed by forces external to us, by culture, by ways of seeing, by ways of understanding the world. We've talked about Gramsci, we've talked about Wittgenstein, we've talked about a range of cases of truth politics, you might say. We've looked at torture, climate change, different types of feminism, and the stakes involved in those, how the different types of feminism bring different ways of seeing into the world, and depending on what you see, you're going to choose a different politics, right? So all of those were very much examples of what we were looking at. We looked at why we live in territorial states. What is it about? What truth was it that led us to develop territorial states? And we developed some theories about what might be behind that piece of our history. We looked at obedience, why sometimes people collectively wake up and shake off these codes of ways of seeing collectively en masse. We looked at media bias, the division of the world into a sort of actually not division of the world, but rather the interdependency of the world in conditions of economic globalization and some of the stakes involved in that, and whether or not we actually need to be as involved in this sort of neoliberal globalization as we might think, because sometimes that's presented to us as the way things have to be. And we challenged that a little bit and we said that perhaps there's other ways that we could relate to this. Because of course it all depends on how you see the world. And so this week it's perhaps appropriate then that we're asking the question what we can do to change the world. But instead of getting all sort of like maybe a nostalgic and idealistic about this topic, we're actually going to apply the same methods of criticism that we've been looking at all semester to this topic as well. And you might say, well, how is that possible? Because I mean, surely that's why we're doing what we're doing. We want to change the world. Why was this class even structured the way it was if some kind of politics or goal or aspiration is not in mind? Well, that's fair enough. That's a legitimate question. But I think it behooves us to try to be honest and to ask what the stakes are of trying to change the world. What is behind this idea that we can somehow change the world? What are we choosing to see about the world when we say that that's possible or desirable? And what are we not choosing to see? And so in a way, we're coming full circle back on ourselves to ask this question here today. So I wanted to start by just looking at this slide here. This is a slide that compares, first of all, on the left we have what's known as the Mercator Projection. That is the standard way that we look at a map in the world, and I'm going to put a video for you guys on the Blackboard page which goes with this slide. It's only about 3 or 4 minutes long, and it's a clip from the TV show West Wing, and you'll see a much more detailed discussion of why these maps are being shown to you here at the moment. But it's I'm just trying to make a point that the way we see the world, the lens that we see the world, the lens through which we observe the world, is important here, because it changes the question of what we see. It changes the facts of the world that we're willing to see, and in fact, the West Wing discussion is very useful here because it dramatizes a little bit the stakes of what's going on in these two images. But just some basic points. I mean, the Mercator projection was developed I think in the 17th century by European navigators, and it was designed clearly to try to put a sort of an emphasis on what was going on in the space of the world in which the Europeans were living. And if you could see the full size of the map, you'd see that, and you can already see it a little bit there. You can see that Greenland, for example, is very, very large on this image, and Iceland too is very, very large. But in fact, in terms of landmass, this is very distorted, because the truth is that if you look at Australia in landmass terms is 3 times the size of Greenland, but you'd never think it to look at the map that you're being shown here. So why do we have a map that is such a falsehood, right? This is in no way, shape, or form true. And yet it's the map that most of us recognize and most of us are sort of shown when we're learning about maps and the maps of the world in school. So the problem of the map is that it makes everything bigger at the top and the bottom. It makes Greenland look huge and Australia look tiny, and these are complete distortions. So why do we use it? Well, possibly because the people who invented navigation, as we were saying, they're European, right? So it's possible because the people at the time who were sort of at the birth of the early modern period when the nation-state form was being globalized, it's just possible that they felt that this map would better suit their interests, right? I mean, not that they consciously felt that they wanted to sort of impose this map on everyone, but that was the map according to the way they saw the world, and that was the map that got generalized. It just so happens that they were the most powerful people on Earth at the time, and so consequently it was the map that they offered to everyone as the true map of the world. But it's not necessarily true, right? So there's another map on the right called the Gall-Peters projection, which is completely different, and it's not exactly accurate either, but what it does is it kind of reverses the mistake of the Mercator projection, and frames the Mercator projection sort of inversely, putting the emphasis on the equatorial countries and trying to make them look pretty equal, and then narrowing the band. As you can see up at the top, the European countries look a lot smaller. And the creator of this map argued that this was in fact a much more accurate way of seeing at the world. And of course there's a lot of problems with this map as well, because it sort of creates the opposite problem, and you have countries that should be quite large getting distorted. But it is actually quite a bit more accurate in many respects at the same time. So it's not a correct map, but it's wrong in a manner that's exactly opposite to the way that the Mercator projection is wrong. And so the question would be then, whose interests would it suit if the world was seen this way, right? And this map was the map that we learned in school, right? Which people or which parts of the world would it sort of imply were more important or were more at the center of things? What I think these maps show us, and why I'm showing them to you, is that they show us that the way we see truth is always a choice that we make, whether we are conscious that we're making these choices or not. They reveal to us the importance of power then, the fact that through the accident of history, certain people develop certain ways of seeing things, and those ways of seeing things survive and linger sometimes as the artifacts of truth well into the future, even though the situation wherein those maps were developed might have changed since then. So what we're saying here is that the powerful get to make decisions, the weak don't, and this has implications, of course, for the way we see truth. So we get upset when we don't see the world getting better. We get upset when we see that the things that we think are obviously wrong, when they don't get fixed, or when people don't take care of them, or the electoral representatives that we vote for don't take care of them, or they do the opposite of what we thought we were electing them for. So there are all kinds of frustrations that we can experience in relation to the politics of changing the world. But is it a good thing to get that frustrated, right? Obviously it's going to be stressful for ourselves and stressful for our bodies, but that's not really what I mean. It's possible that human beings, just in general, have a rather over-exaggerated sense of their own self-importance. And let's just play with that idea for a minute, right? Perhaps like the Mercator map projection, right? The Mercator map projection reveals an unconscious desire on the part of the people who created it to make themselves more central in the world than than they were conscious of. They just made themselves more geographically visible in the world, and they didn't see the problem with that. They thought it was a mathematical compromise that was important because, of course, the Earth is round, and if you're going to represent the Earth or the globe on a flat map, you're going to have to make some mathematical distortions in order to get all the pieces to fit together on a single piece of paper. So that's totally understandable in some ways, but there's different ways those compromises can be made. And what appears to some people as obvious truth and as simple logic that goes without saying can appear to others to be quite political. So similarly here, we all seem to make an assumption that we are somehow important enough to want to have the world changed in our own, or to deserve to have the world changed in our own sort of interests, or what we observe to be morally or ethically superior. And this means, of course, that we have a sense of ourselves. We don't think about it this way, but if we think about it, it reveals to us that we have a very sort of grand notion of our own self-importance, that we think that we are the ones who are right and whose desired changes should be effected into the world. And this is an old tradition of thinking. In fact, it goes back to, in Western society, it goes back to the book of Genesis, Genesis 1, sections 27 to 28, or verses, where the Bible says that God gives the planet to man in order to subdue it and to have dominion over it and all its various resources inside it. And so we have an early tradition of seeing the world that way in Western culture. But of course, we don't live in a very religious society anymore. We live in the era of modernity. And science is the champion of human affairs nowadays in terms of giving us guidance on what we do and how we make decisions. So does science do the same thing that the religion does? Perhaps in a way it does. What Maya Zafis argues anyway is that the man of reason and science today doesn't really think that differently to the man of religion so long ago. Scientific man tends to believe that he has power over things, that he has the power to affect change and to bring about a world that looks better and functions better. But the world is more messy than the man of science seems to be able to admit. And I think that's what the Mercator Projection suggests, that just because science can come up with a way of seeing truth doesn't mean that truth is absolutely correct. It doesn't mean that truth is sound. There might be other scientific ways of seeing the world, right? And that's the problem, right? Because science itself is supposed to be the truth. It's supposed to be an accumulation of knowledge over time that gives us the truth about the world. But what if the truth isn't just something out there? What if the truth is something that is actually created for us and offered to us? So I think this is kind of what we've been arguing all semester, really. And so this gives us a huge problem, right? Because if we think we can fix things, if we think we have power over the world to make it better, it stands to reason that we would want to use science or religion or whatever framework of knowledge that we think would be correct to bring about change in the world. But this is the problem, of course, is that implies that we are the masters of decision making in the world, and that we are somehow in a central place of importance in the world, that we can make and that we deserve to have our views represented in the decisions about how the world is operated. But what Maya Zafis does is she invokes the philosopher Michel Foucault, who we've talked about many times in this class. And if you go back to the obedience chapter, you will see that once upon a time there we mentioned the repressive hypothesis. And here, of course, Foucault is famously arguing, the philosopher Foucault is arguing that, maybe power is not something that we have in our hands. Maybe power is something that has us in its grip. We are effectively the servants of power. We are the relays of power, as opposed to the actors of power, or the enactors of power. So what this means is that where we think that truth is something that we find out about the world, and then we use our power to affect change in the world to match what we think that truth requires of us. In fact, it seems that the truth is something that creates us. It directs us to do things in the world, in which case maybe we don't have the power that we think we do to act on truth, but rather truth acts on us, and it's truth that has the power. We are not then therefore powerful or having power, but truth and power is something that has us. This would be very, very challenging then for any hope or aspiration that we might have to change the world. It's something that we would worry about because we would therefore have an anxiety or a worry immediately that maybe the things that we would be hoping to change to make the world a better place might just be thoughts that are in us as a result of the desires of power or the wishes of power. And that's not what we want. That we want more confidence than that. We want to be confident that we're doing the right thing, that we're literally and really making the world a better place. So how can we try to have that confidence then? What can we do to improve our confidence in our abilities in this regard concerning truth? So I think in this slide we're obviously looking at the main case study of this chapter of the textbook, and the focus here is on some points surrounding the Iraq War, and the photo here is from London on February 15th, 2003, which, for those of you who don't know, was the biggest anti-war protest ever in human history. Thousands and thousands of people all over the world, 600 cities, came out on the streets in a globally coordinated demonstration against the Iraq War. No cause in human history had ever generated such a large protest before, and I think to this day it remains the largest protest ever seen on planet Earth. And yet, even though all these people were arguing against the war, it still happened. It still went ahead, and it remains, I think, probably one of the most unpopular wars ever fought. I think it still obviously has a reputation for being a war which was a harbinger for so much destruction, not just in Iraq but also at home, human lives destroyed, even for the survivors, for the veterans of the wars. But also then think about the civil liberties, think about the rights and freedoms that people used to enjoy in America and in the United Kingdom that have been compromised because of the laws that have been introduced in the prosecution of the so-called war on terror. So sometimes we have this tendency to sort of think that, well, it's obvious, there's a truth and we have to act on this truth to make the world a better place, but we don't know sometimes whether the approach that we're adopting in this lecture, at least, is to think about maybe the truths aren't as certain as we think they are. This was one time when people definitely did have a truth, and they definitely did act on that truth, and came up against another truth, right, which was the truth that if we don't act, then there's potentially a confrontation with Iraq down the road, wherein they'll use weapons of mass destruction, and can we afford the risk? This is the great sort of tragedy, if you will, of politics. And I think it's that tragedy of politics that we're kind of trying to explore in this lecture, pretty much. So a lot of people took different positions on the Iraq War. Maya Zafis notes, for example, how British parents of soldiers who had lost their sons and daughters in the war came together to try to say this war was based on lies. And I think probably the jury is now in on that, and we know that there were very nearly lies told. In certain instances, of course, it's hard to just sort of reduce it all to the question of who lied or who didn't lie, but it's all but being conceded now, even by members of the Bush administration themselves, press secretaries, that kind of thing, that especially if you look at the Valerie Plame affair, there were definitely manipulations of the truth, and if not outright lies, certainly very troubling interpretations were created and fabricated out of thin air for very, very weak facts. potentially to do with Saddam Hussein's potential to have weapons of mass destruction. And so certainly, and I think Maya Zafis sort of lets on at this, that, retrospectively we can see that this is the case. But at the time, a lot of people did think that this was all very much a real and urgent threat. So we ended up with this sort of question about, well, who's right? The protesters, they don't want to sacrifice human lives of Iraqis for American freedom, and the people on the other side saying that, well, why should Americans have to die down the road when we can afford to nip this thing in the bud now? So on both sides, in a way, right, there's this question of whose lives count as more, whose lives count in fact as lives. At the end of the day, it seems that the lives that counted more were the American lives, because of course we went into Iraq. And if you look at some of the numbers, the figures cited in the chapter, I've updated these numbers actually because I looked at the website just before recording this lecture, and I tried to find out what the newer numbers were, and you'll see that they are quite different. There's anywhere between 112,000 and 123,000 Iraqis dead as of today, according to the website that Maya Zafis cites in the chapter, which is IraqWarBodyCount.com. So potentially, of course, there's many, many more Iraqis that have died in the conflict, of course, because the number, it's a guessing game to a certain extent, right? The Western forces present in Iraq don't count the bodies. They say they don't have the time or the resources to do that. And so it's up to independent third parties, non-profits, etc., to try to guess the amount of people who are dead. I should note that in the Lancet, which is one of the world's leading medical journals, the number of potentially dead was 500,000. And that was roundly sort of criticized as being way over generous, but they reckon they've got pretty good statistical methods for projecting or extrapolating from field interviews the amount of people who are likely dead, but again, highly challenged. And so the number that tends to count is a lot lower than that, and that's the Iraq war. But these are the numbers that were sort of pretty reliably certain that have died. So one of the great problems in this debate is that we get into this sort of mudslinging then about whose lives count the most. And one thing that the anti-war protesters probably understate is that the people who were going to war are probably not people who are, evil, right? They're people who are coming to the table in good faith, and they believe that they have identified a problem. They believe, for example, that Saddam Hussein's plan was to develop WMDs now or sometime in the near future, and that it was better to seize the momentum of 9/11, as Rumsfeld was reported as having said the day after 9/11. Better to seize the momentum and try to make something of it, and attach this energy in the country to the problem of Iraq in order to try to forestall a potential risk from that country down the road. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is that he wasn't just doing that because he was evil or manipulative, although he might be some of those things depending on your point of view. From his point of view, at least, he was coming to the table in good faith. And I would imagine that it would be realistic to sort of assume that he cared as much about human lives as the people on the streets in these cities. It's not a lack of care of human life that you can accuse Rumsfeld of. You can accuse him of many things, but he believed that certain ends justified the means. And we all, in a way, make that calculation every day. Just sometimes the stakes are higher than others, and we end up in these kinds of debates. So this chapter is not about saying who's right or who's wrong. It's about saying, I think, something about the politics of truth in relation to this desire we have to change the world for the better. Okay? So one expert, a philosopher who looks a lot at these sorts of issues is Jacques Derrida. He died there a few years ago, but he's probably one of the most influential philosophers in the world on this question of responsibility. And Maya Zafis offers the two quotes that are in the slide here as ways of identifying the problems of responsibility that are caught up in the dilemma of going to war, the decision to go to war. Now, obviously we want to, if we do go to war, it's typically to make the world a better place. People don't go to war for selfish reasons anymore. They go to war for humanitarian reasons. They go to war for security reasons, for national self-interests delineated in terms of security, that kind of thing. And so we have then different things that call to us in terms of responsibility here. The responsibility to invade, the responsibility to not invade, and no matter which way you cut it, we're hearing a sort of an ethical or a moral responsibility being sort of expressed. And so in Iraq then, the two main arguments that were iterated were either to go in to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or alternatively to liberate Iraqis. This was another argument that was expressed, to go in and help, as Donald Rumsfeld put it, those people. But those are not the same goal, of course, and different elements of the Bush administration and the foreign journalists and observers who were supporting the Bush administration, for example, the Canadian op-ed writer and columnist Michael Ignatieff, among other people. There were many people in Britain who also shared his view, but they were not so much concerned with WMD as they were concerned with a dictator and a tyrant, and they wanted to see that tyrant gotten rid of. So these two goals then, the sort of liberal goal of going into Iraq and the neoconservative goal of going into Iraq, which was for WMDs and that kind of thing, are obviously very different. But what they have in common is that they both shared the basic idea of saying that some people's lives were expendable in the pursuit of a goal, right? And no matter what their actual perspective was, the goal was, they definitely thought that it was okay to shed lives, to sacrifice lives in the achievement of the goal. And what they ended up concluding as well was that the interest that we would defend would be the Western interests. So they were deciding at the end of the day that Western interests were more important than Iraqi lives, and are even perhaps from the humanitarian point of view, that Western lives and certain Iraqi lives were more important than the lives of Saddam Hussein and his National Guard, for example. But either way, there's a hierarchy of lives here. And what Derrida sort of does, interestingly enough, is he enters into the argument about these sorts of questions, not so much taking a side, but speaking in the abstract and saying, look, I cannot, as he says here in his first quote, I cannot respond to the call, the request, the obligation, or even the love of another without sacrificing the other, or the other others. And this is a precise point here. I'm going to respond, if I'm a neoconservative, to the interests of American citizens, and those are my other, and I'm going to sacrifice the lives of Iraqis. Or the other others, the could be, if you wanted to take the more liberal argument, the other others could be Saddam Hussein's National Guard, because you're stepping in to safeguard the lives and protect the interests and liberate Iraqis. So no matter whether you're taking the hardcore conservative view or the more liberal view in favor of invading Iraq, you were always creating this hierarchy of the other others, right? So this is an interesting point, as Myasafis argues, because, and Derrida here comes up with the concept of the aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A, the aporia, as a way of thinking through this kind of contradiction here, because if we're going to say Western lives are more valuable, then we have created a kind of a contradiction in terms of responsibility. The idea is that if we're going to affect change in the world, someone's going to get hurt, right? And so we want to do good in the world, we want to make the world a better place, but in order to achieve that, we have to do something wrong, we have to do something immoral. And sometimes that's unavoidable, especially when we're under a very urgent sort of set of pressures to make a decision now. We're going to hurt Iraqi soldiers, or we're going to hurt Iraqi civilians and call them collateral damage. As Derrida says, as soon as I enter into a relation with the other, with the gaze, look, request, love, command, or call of the other, I know I can only respond by sacrificing whatever obliges me also to respond in the same way, in the same instant to all others. So I'm going to respond to Americans who are concerned about their future, and I'm going to deny the lives of Iraqis who are also probably concerned about their future. But because I've created this hierarchy, because I've decided I love some people and I don't love other people, then I will have to shed some lives, and therefore I've entered into an aporia, or a situation of contradiction, where I can't love everyone equally. This is very interesting, of course. In one point Zaiphus makes is about the people in Darfur. In that time, around 2003, 2004, there were major worries, actually probably more like 2006, 2007, but there were major worries about genocide in Darfur, and no one could really do anything about it because all the Western forces had been committed to the Middle East. And so, there is that cost there again, that if I'm responding to the call of love for some people, i.e. the call of my love for Americans and America or Western society or what have you, then I cannot fully love or respond to the call to love other people, and it's a problem. Yeah, it's an unresolvable contradiction. So we have all these issues about responsibility and decision making under pressures of emergency from Derrida, and then we have this idea at the end of the chapter, or towards the end of the chapter. Zaiphus offers us some thoughts from Robert Cox. Robert Cox he's sort of famous for having said that theory is always to some extent or other for someone or for some purpose, even if the people enunciating it don't know it. Of course, a classic example of that for us was the example of the phrenologists who did not know that they were racist, right? But I mean, they thought they were being scientific, and when we looked at it, from our perspective today, it looks profoundly racist, but that's not something we accuse the phrenologists of generally. So, much like Michael Dillon then last week, Cox is saying that the world social order, if you will, is not fixed, it's fluid, right? So different people in different times have different relationships to knowledge and different types of setups of knowledge, and we respect that, of course. But the point is that despite these differences, that the problems, the one thing that all these different sort of social eras share in common, whether it's the era of the medieval Christian period or the more sort of modern Enlightenment period that we have today, both of those sort of ways of thinking about the world create what Cox says are problem-solving theories. And they are, he says, he's trying to sort of basically say that problem-solving theory is generally the link between how we think about the world and how we act in it, right? So problem-solving theory is the theory that's offered to us sort of by society in the round, or created by society in the round, as a guide or a framework for thinking through the problems that happen within the terms of the particular perspective that is your original point of departure. Which means that, if you live in a Christian society, where there is no separation of church and state, for example, you'll think that the primary purpose of government is to facilitate the transferal of human souls into heaven. I mean, that's the goal of a theological state, right? To do God's will on earth. Today we have a separation of church and state, for example, and so this separates this idea of the problem of getting into heaven, which becomes a personal problem in the modern state. That you solve on your own, or on your own with your pastor or with your community or what have you, but it's certainly not a problem that the state takes on. Today the state is supposed to be scientific, but as we've said, that the science, if you will, of the state is going to be shaped by culture, and so even though the science of the state often sort of represents itself as factual, or acting on the basis of facts, or fact motivated, fact driven, in fact, it's going to be often the case that it's operating within a particular perspective. It's using, as the phrenologists used, particular sort of way of arranging scientifically garnered facts, but within a sort of a framework that might be motivated by a cultural prejudice of some sort. And so, if science is sort of always assuming that it's true, and if the science of statecraft is always assuming it's true, it could be blind to the risk of its own predisposition, its own cultural predisposition, that this is the point of departure, of course, that Cox is talking about here. So we know then that social orders can change. We can see the change from a Christian era to a Christian medieval era to a sort of modern Enlightenment era. But and we can see that change. But what doesn't change is the abstract linkage between the two. That they think there's a truth that can guide us in the solving of particular problems, and that we should act on the basis of that truth. Uncritically, right? And this is the problem, Cox says, that we need to solve. So he brings in what he calls critical theory in order to try to help us to get out of the system we are in into hopefully perhaps a better system. And that might seem radical, but the point here really is to be sensitive to the linkage between how we think about the world and our theories. We think, for example, about the linkage between the financial crisis that we've been going through since 2008 and the types of problems that the government sees in the way that government is trying to solve those problems to sort of put the system back together again, without thinking for a minute perhaps that the system itself might be the problem, i.e. capitalism. And that might seem radical, but then you start to think about the same type of dilemma being sort of, or the same type of mental exercise in relation to the war on terror, and the fact that we look at rogue states as problems within the system that need to be fixed so that the system of international relations might work better, instead of thinking that perhaps it's the system itself that's creating the rogue states somehow, or that they are a byproduct or a side effect of a system that we have today. And you could make that argument, and in fact we have in a way made that argument already, because we've looked at economic conditions which can create poverty. We've looked at the imposition of the territorial nation-state form on peoples that don't necessarily respond very well to that, or who have no historical linkage to that form. So we've got a couple of ideas in our head already that could show why the system as it is could be potentially sort of contributing to that. And there's a chapter in the piece, in the book, about imperialism, which you could read if you wanted to look further into that. But critical theory takes this idea of the system, right, and our efforts to try to fix it, whether it's the financial system or the international system, and our efforts to try to fix those systems, and instead takes a step back and says, well, look, maybe it's not so much that there's problems in the system, but that the system itself is creating the problems, in which case we need an alternative system. And that's, I think, why critical theory has a contribution to make. Now, of course, no one's saying that critical theory is automatically going to make the world a better place. Say, for example, we have a revolution and critical theory is adhered to. Probably some other whole new set of problems is going to emerge. So certainly we wouldn't want to be naive or idealistic about it. The world's not going to become a better place overnight. But sometimes change is necessary. And when change comes, you get some good things, but you also get some new bad things in relation to that. And no one's making any commitments to you or promises or guarantees to you in relation to that point, to be sure. So, conclusions. Are we going to get conclusions here? We're frustrated because Maya Zafis, Jacques Derrida, Robert Cox, all these people who are famous and well-known commentators in this area are telling us that we need to accept our vulnerability. We need to not have hero complex. We need to know that our truth is imperfect. We need to be modest in the face of the knowledge claims and the responsibility claims that are exerted upon us in order to act in the world and potentially act violently in the world. And I think this is entirely legitimate frustration. If we're feeling frustrated now, that's entirely fine. I guess that's the whole point. But I think Maya Zafis makes a very good point towards the end of the piece, and it's precisely this, that it's no cause for despair to admit vulnerability. It's no cause for despair to admit that we are insecure in the world because our knowledge isn't sufficient of the world, right? We don't know. We can never fully know all the threats that challenge us, the threats that confront us. And this is very much continuing the type of this is very much continuing the type of logic that Michael Dillon was pursuing last week with us, right? So what does this despair mean? I mean, it means that in a way it means that we can't cut ourselves off from the world, right? In a way it means that we'll never be masters. We'll never be completely in charge. We'll never totally be the boss. We have a fantasy when we look at our television. We look at Jack Bauer on 24, for example, and he knows exactly where he needs to be, or Superman or Batman. You know, they know exactly where they need to be. They're always making the right choices. They're rarely flawed. Obviously, certain representations of Batman might challenge that, but by and large, at the end of the day, he always makes it through. And so too with ourselves. You know, we need to ask, you know, do we want to sort of adopt a sort of a superhero posture in the world and be right all the time, or do we want to sort of maybe take a step back for a minute and understand that, you know, there's other people here too, and it's not like the movies, right? It's not like the movies. It's not like the TV shows where one person can make all the decisions. In real life, compromises have to be made. In real life, we have to bring other people along with us. There's an excellent quote in Maya Zaifas' chapter towards the end where she talks about the importance of remembering that all politics is negotiated, and that, you know, the fact that we think we're right doesn't mean that we can leave other people behind and dismiss them as somehow wrong. In politics today, especially, for example, in relation to, think about the 2013 bombings in Boston and the debate about the use of the so-called Miranda rights on the prime suspect in those arrests, in that whole controversy. And you'll see what I mean, right? Some people say the kid was a terrorist and should be sent to Guantanamo Bay, and other people say no, he's an American citizen, so that entitles him to his basic rights. And, you know, it's clear that people are not going to agree on these things. But then again, and look at the quote here, I guess I'll move around to this, I'll talk about it now. Zaifas says that if we forget about other people, even if we disagree with them, then we're actually doing something wrong. Like, what she's saying is that there's actually something wrong, as she says here, with the idea of changing what's wrong with the world. And I don't think she fully I think she's saying this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? I mean, in a way, there's nothing wrong with wanting to change what's wrong with the world. Obviously, it's an ideal that we all live to and aspire to. But there's definitely something wrong with the idea of changing what's wrong with the world when we believe that we are the center of the universe, right? When we believe that we and only we are the Jack Bauer, or the Batman, or the Superman, can make everything all right. You know, we're sort of setting ourselves up as these superheroes. We have hero complex. And I think that what she's saying is that the experience of inability, the frustration that we share when we realize that we cannot convince other people, is not a bad thing. It's an inability that's a salutary inability, right? It's an inability that benefits us in some ways. So what Zaifas tries, I think if I understand what she's saying towards the end, is that she's trying to remember to get us to be modest and to respect the fact that it's important to bring the people who disagree with us along with the change that we want to see in the world, right? And that these processes are going to be slow and painstaking. As she says, other people are, after all, also the best bits about our world, right? And I think that's kind of a cute thing to say, right? To say that other people are the reason why we're here. Other people are the reason why we're doing this. This, she says, is what makes politics important after all. It's an arena in which hugely important questions are raised on which people disagree. That's the nature of politics. And if we don't like that, if we let our frustration with people disagreeing with each other get in the way of our experience of politics, then we've missed the point, right? And so on that note then, folks, thank you for what's been a great semester. I've really enjoyed doing these video lectures for you guys. It's definitely made me go back to my lecture notes and revise a lot of my material that I was using in the classroom and rethink how I was reading the book and using the book. So it's been a great experience for me. I hope these videos have been useful for you. as an alternative way of presenting the information that we would otherwise be looking at in lectures. I hope that these videos are some things you can come back to again and again when you're preparing for your exams. They'll always be here for you as you're studying for your final exam. And of course, I'm here for you as you're studying for your final exam, and you can always contact me by email, or we can set up a Skype appointment, or even meet on campus if that's possible. Just let me know what your preference is, and we can certainly put you in the best possible standing to get the best grade you can for the final exam. So thanks so much for your patience and the privilege of letting me do this for you guys. I really enjoyed it. Take care. Bye bye.